Welcome to Ancient Revelation, the #1 investigation network, decoding primordial secrets of the Earth.
Beyond the pyramids, beyond all you think you know, lies an undiscovered Egypt.
There's quite an explicit portrayal of sexual love before marriage.
How did ancient Egyptians live and die?
Why should they have all been herded here? This almost is sinister.
The classic clues of war, famine, and disease.
Now Peter Woodward reveals startling new discoveries about an ancient land, Egypt beyond the pyramids.
Mention Cairo, and most people think of a place like this. A timeless world where quiet lives are led behind walls and shutters, narrow streets filled with the smell of incense, and the faint clack of dominoes echoing from a drowsy cafe. Well, all that's still here. But there's another side to Cairo, which perhaps better typifies this old town at the start of a new millennium. We're at the entrance to Ramses train station in Cairo. Each day, 2 million Egyptians arrive to work in this busy city, increasing the population to over 16 million. It's a place of contrasts. Camels move along the streets beside flashy imported cars. The old mixes with the new. You can hear the Islamic call to prayer alongside Egyptian pop. As you watch these people rush to their jobs, it seems very difficult to imagine ancient Egypt. But just the other day, I saw the face of the Pharaoh Akhenaten walk by. And over there sits an old man whose features are the same as Seti I. The ghosts of pharaonic Egypt are still here. It's just harder to see them. If you want to connect these people with their ancestors, then you have to get out of Cairo. Here in the country, it's still possible to glimpse the barest traces of the everyday life of ancient Egypt. A shadoof, similar to this one, has been bringing water to these fields since the age of Ramses. But the truth is, we know very little about the life of most of the people who once lived here. I don't mean the kings and the priests and the scribes, but the peasants who raised the food, the workers who built the temples, spun the cloth, molded the pots, crafted the boats and manned the armies. The common people of Egypt were mostly illiterate, and so their voices from the past are harder to hear. But at least today, we are trying to listen to those voices. For the story of ancient Egypt is their story too. The source of Egypt's great success as a civilization was not the authority of her kings, nor the might of her armies. It was this: the rich black soil of the Nile Valley. Each year, like clockwork, the great river rose to cover this land and renew its vitality with rich nutrients. It was only this event that kept Egypt alive and kept the deserts away. As the life-giving waters receded, the farmers stepped back onto their lands, and Egypt prospered for another year.
At the height of its glory, ancient Egypt had a population of approximately 7 million, about that of present-day London. The vast majority lived on farms. The crops they planted and harvested not only fed their countrymen, they formed the basis of the nation's financial system. There was no currency. Debts, salaries, purchases in the marketplace were all paid with commodities, most often grain from fields.
Herodotus was very impressed when he went to Egypt and said, oh, Egypt is the gift of the Nile. Egypt is the gift of the Egyptian farmers. Without those farmers, it would just be a big, annually inundated floodplain.
Then, as now, there was only one river in all of Egypt, and it was the Nile on which every growing thing depended. All agricultural life functioned according to a well-defined cycle. The annual cycle began when summer rains in the highlands of what is today Ethiopia and Sudan swelled the river. As it entered Egypt, the Nile surged over its banks and deposited its load of fertile topsoil onto the farmland which kept Egypt alive. Generally, the river could be counted on to return the life-giving flood each year. But there were periods when the flood was too low or too high, and crops suffered or failed. Every Egyptian understood this peril. Their myths and stories, the very essence of their religious practices, all had to do with the river and its critical importance in their lives.
As soon as the inundation started to drop, you might say that all hell broke loose, because it became very crucial to start preparing the fields.
After the flood, the ground was lightly turned, then the seed scattered and worked in by the feet of men and animals. Egyptian farmers planted vegetables and legumes like beans and lentils, but by far the most important crops were wheat and barley. These grains were the basis of the two mainstays of the Egyptian diet.
Bread is something that everyone ate, regardless of what class you're from, and even now in Egypt, the word for bread is the same word as for life, aish. So to live is to have bread, basically.
While wheat was ground for bread, barley was raised for the other staple of the Egyptian diet, beer. Beer was consumed by everyone, but it was largely the daily drink of the common people. Royalty or the wealthy favored wine. Grapes were extensively grown, and Egyptian wine was sought after by the connoisseurs of the ancient world. Papyrus texts reveal that although bread and beer were at all daily meals, the diet of the ancient Egyptians was varied and nutritious. Leeks, onions, garlic, lettuce and cucumbers were common. Fruits included dates, melons, figs and pomegranates. Although Egyptians didn't know of citrus or sugar, they indulged their sweet tooth with abundant amounts of honey. Farmers also raised cattle, pigs, sheep, goats and donkeys. Although pork was common in the diet of peasants, beef was generally too expensive.
Work that has been done on zooarchaeological remains shows that obviously wealthier people, such as the Pharaoh and his court, would consume far more beef than would people who were much poorer or workmen.
With the river being rarely more than a few miles from any Egyptian's home, fish was an extremely important food item. The river also created thick marshes, which were home to great flocks of migrating ducks and geese. Men, both rich and poor, hunted waterfowl with carved throwing sticks for sport and food. These wildfowl supplemented the domestically raised ducks and geese, which provided eggs, flesh and fat. Chickens did not arrive on Egyptian farms until more than 2,500 years after the pyramids were built. When at last the crops were ripe, farm life entered the next critical phase in the rural cycle, the harvest. Wheat and barley were cut with sharp stone or copper sickles, then threshed by pounding the heads of the grain against a slotted piece of wood. The grain was separated from the chaff by throwing it in the air. Although women were not expected to work in the fields, harvest was the exception, and everyone, including children, pitched in. Most land in Egypt was owned by the pharaoh or the great temples. This meant that the joy of the harvest was tempered when representatives of the owner arrived to collect their tax.
We know that the ordinary Egyptians probably always resented the taxes levied on them by the state. We do find amongst the written records of the elite references to the fact that the tax collectors can expect trouble when they go to collect the sacks of grain from the farmers. And in fact, the tax collectors go with escorts, men carrying big sticks.
Then, as now, there were penalties for cheating on your taxes, although the punishment was far more dramatic. But not even taxes could take away from the satisfaction farmers felt from the bounty which rewarded their labor. Harvest meant that the cycle of life in the Nile Valley had wound through its season. Life in Egypt would be free from want for another year.
We've looked at what life was like for farmers in rural Egypt. But the ancient Egyptians had great cities too, like Memphis and Thebes. We're on our way to the site of what was once a thriving city here in the Nile Delta, about 100 miles north of Cairo. This place was renowned throughout the ancient world for its wine and its perfumes, but it has more questions than answers. a place of great mystery. We are heading towards the site of the ancient city of Mendes.
The city of Mendes was located on one of the many branches of the Nile as it fanned out into the rich delta. Today, farm workers plant rice on land that was once part of the great city. Mendes had its beginnings in the earliest days of the Old Kingdom and evolved into a busy trading port and important religious center. But it appears that at one point in Mendes' long history, the life of this city was interrupted by a mysterious tragedy.
Over 4,000 years ago, after 500 years of astonishing prosperity, the Old Kingdom dissolved into chaos. We do not know why. There is evidence here of people suddenly packing into the city, of burning and destruction, hurried burials, of whole families dying together. The classic clues of war, famine, and disease.
There are no written records here at Mendes or elsewhere to explain the decline of the Old Kingdom. But Dr. Donald Redford of Penn State University heads a team that is searching for answers. They are excavating an Old Kingdom temple built here in Mendes over 4,000 years ago. As they have uncovered more of this place of worship, they have also come upon a place of death.
So we're on top of the temple now, and
Yes.
what was it you found in this area?
Well, we first got into a massive destruction layer. Someone had lit a fire at some time and fired the bricks, and they'd tumbled down in a great conflagration. And then under that, we found a surface associated with the structure, whatever it was. And on that surface, we found a big surprise. And one of the great surprises of my archaeological career, and a very dramatic one, in fact.
Oh, this is a really deep excavation. It must have taken you some time.
Donald leads me down into the deepest part of his work in the temple. It was here that workers uncovered startling evidence of more than just a fire.
At this point, well, right where I'm standing, in fact, we first discovered 3 skeletons, an old man on top of an old woman on top of a child in this spot right here. Then over here we found 2 more skeletons side by side. They had not been buried. This is not a burial because they lay in contorted attitudes, suggesting they had died traumatically and on the spot.
So the people who died in this place, men, women, children, were they trapped here? Were they prisoners?
It's hard to say. Actually, the walls confining the court are not that high, and they slope out, in fact. It would seem as though if they wanted to escape and nothing was preventing them, they could have. But why should they have all been herded here? This almost is sinister.
You think there may be more bodies here?
Oh, undoubtedly there are. I would dearly love to know whether we can say anything about the relationships of these groups, father or male, female, child, whether they're indigenous to the area perhaps, or whether they're foreign to the area. All of this, I think, could be answered, but it will take a long time and considerably more excavation.
Even with excavation, what happened here may never be understood. Was there a revolt or civil war in Mendes and these people were executed? Was there some unknown invasion and these were local citizens killed by the conquerors? Like so many questions in Egyptology, there may never be a definitive answer. We do know that after these deaths, life went on.
So after this disaster, the city and the temple seem to have been abandoned in some way, but then later on there was more building here?
Oh yes, it was sacred space for an extended period of time, and the temple was rebuilt in the New Kingdom, refurbished in the centuries after that, and in fact did not reach its full extent until about 550 BC. And I'd like to show you that latest stage, and in fact it's the largest and most dramatic.
Right. So this is another part of this huge temple, Don?
Yes, this in fact is the Holy of Holies.
That's really dramatic, isn't it?
Oh, it is. It's fantastic. It was the latest item to be added to the temple, and it is a great enclosed court with an indirect access so that you can't see directly into it.
So they wanted to keep it secret?
That's right, yes. In which there were 4 of these gigantic shrines. 3 of them were destroyed and have collapsed. The fragments still remain. Only 1 survives. Even that, an attempt was made to destroy, yes, but they were not successful, so it still stands, and it's the largest monument north of the pyramids in Egypt.
It's really dramatic, especially from down here, and there were 4 of those.
There were 4, yes.
Each with a god inside?
That's right, each a form of the ram god.
The ram god was held in great esteem by the citizens of Mendes. It was a symbol of potency and strength, which would ensure a robust prosperity for the city's inhabitants.
So this would have been the center of life for the whole town?
Yes, it was, in a sense, the focal point of the entire community. Everyone would have considered himself a devotee at various levels of the ram god. That was his god, his town god.
So this temple was at the center of a great city. How long did all this last?
Well, over, 5,000 years, I suppose. But we could have still seen this temple essentially standing in the Middle Ages. It was only after that that it was demolished for the stone, for the limestone in particular. And through the depredations of early archaeologists who were treasure hunters, the whole thing collapsed.
Birds nest in this place now. But 2,500 years ago, a god lived here. And after the dark night of Mendes' unexplained tragedy in the Old Kingdom, he again smiled on this ancient town. Mendes' greatest years were from 600 to 330 BC. The remains of the city's great walls overlook what was an active port on the river. Merchant ships from as far away as Greece brought their cargoes here to Mendes' busy harbour. Timber and precious oils were traded for Egyptian grain, gold, and wine. Today, the route of the Nile has shifted far away from this place. The once bustling harbour is now little more than scrub brush and sand. Donald Redford and I walked atop the ancient city walls, and he gave me a sense of the great port that once thrived on this spot.
In the middle background, where the line of trees is, you would have seen the river, the Mendesian branch of the Nile. But in the foreground here, you would have had the harbor coming in, a great triangular-shaped harbor.
So this was a real center of trade.
Oh, very much so, yes. There is no docks, as far as we can say. We found one anchor, by the way, in the excavations, which virtually proves that it is a harbor. And the ships would have been beached, a mooring stake would have been driven in, and then a gangplank laid down, and the porters would have come with their bales and whatnot. Egypt had so much to offer. It was filthy rich with resources that it acted like a great magnet on the peoples of the world. Everybody wanted to come here. Everybody wanted to trade. It was worth your while to even build a ship and go into partnership with a neighboring big man, if you were a Phoenician, and send it down here to Egypt. You would make a fortune.
In addition to the ancient harbour, Donald is also trying to learn more about where people lived here at Mendes.
Yes.
Over here on this side, that is the remains of the town itself.
That's the town. In fact, at this point, you see, you have prime land because it collects the north wind. It has a marvelous location. And so that it was occupied by major public buildings, maybe the house of the governor or whoever was in charge. If one were to excavate, and we have partly excavated over there, you would find great enclosures with rather well-built buildings housing the scribes and the elite of the community. In fact, you can see as we look that there are eroded walls still in place. And these could be plotted, and then we would have a much better idea of these great public buildings. I would love to get out there, and that is on the agenda, if I last that long.
What strikes me standing here is first of all, that you have an entire city that you're digging. It's huge. You have temples, you have not one but two harbours. You have an entire town there that's been virtually unexcavated.
Right.
And it is also quite the most beautiful place, isn't it?
Oh, it is. It's very striking.
Life in Mendes was uniquely cosmopolitan. But in other ways, life here would have been very similar to that in most cities of ancient Egypt.
We do have an idea of what it was like to live in an Egyptian city. And they were quite congested. They didn't have broad avenues generally. They had networks of rather narrow streets, rather irregularly laid out. And the houses were nested together so that you had the large houses of elite individuals surrounded by the houses of people of much lower status.
About the only important resource that Egypt lacked was good timber. The wealthy could purchase lumber from faraway Phoenicia, which is today Lebanon. The poor made do with the trunks of palm trees. Just as in the Egypt of today, shortage of lumber in ancient times was solved by building most houses from mud bricks. The thick bricks made houses which were cool and quite comfortable.
I think from what we see in the arrangement of the houses, and the layout, and the scenes that they show, generally depict, But they were very clean, and they were maintained very well, and also decorated nicely and often painted.
But Egyptian tidiness and pride in their homes did not seem to extend to the streets outside their front doors.
Sanitation was virtually non-existent, even in the houses of the elite. There's no such thing as running water or drainage or anything like that. And we know that the rubbish dumps that built up over time from the continual cleaning of the house and the discarding of waste and so forth, they were quite careful about keeping their houses clean, but the rubbish dump was right around the corner. You dumped around the back of your house.
Like the rest of their countrymen, citizens of Mendes were probably quite gregarious, congregating near the temples and marketplaces to visit their neighbours and hear the news of the day. It was in these social settings that we would have been able to see how much Egyptians cared about their personal appearance.
The Egyptians, like people today, were also very keen on how they looked. And, I mean, image, I won't say was everything, but it certainly played a large part. So the Egyptians spent quite a lot of time, it appears, on adorning themselves.
The fabric of choice for virtually all Egyptian clothing was linen, made from the fibre of flax plants. Although Egypt is today famous for cotton, it wasn't grown in ancient times. It was linen that filled Egypt's looms and was spun into a variety of clothing for the king and his subjects. For the peasant, dress was little more than a loincloth. But for wealthy Egyptians, linen was amazingly versatile and could be fashioned into everything from beautifully pleated skirts to delicately thin shawls.
If we look at the art of the ancient Egyptians, we would think that the Egyptians usually walked around in rather skimpy clothing, enjoying a very balmy climate. And I'm sure in the summer and the spring in Egypt, they did dress very lightly. But in Egypt, the winters are actually very cold. And we can be sure, and there are actually textual references to this, that people would wear quite heavy clothing, you know, robes and long garments to protect themselves from the cold.
Records found in the ruins of one village also show that long before the first boutique, Egyptian women had a sense of fashion and vanity.
I do think that the ancient Egyptian women were conscious of their dress, and one of the quotes we have coming up several times is women complaining that they don't have a thing to wear. And they obviously had something to wear, but it wasn't good enough.
Although many working-class Egyptians spent their days barefoot, getting around Egypt involves walking over a lot of sharp rocks and hot sand. Sandals were popular. The wealthy could afford to have theirs made of leather. The poor accepted straw footwear. Jewellery, even for the poor, was an important part of the image Egyptians wished to present. But no part of grooming and personal style had greater importance than makeup. As an actor, I couldn't resist seeing how I would look as an Egyptian.
Makeup itself probably started as a sort of protection against the sun. Both sexes used it, and most classes of people, from the peasant to the king, wouldn't be caught without it, even during the workday. Eye makeup had several purposes. It kept infection and flies away, and it was believed to have magical properties. It also reduced the glare of the sun, rather like ball players who wear black streaks under their eyes. Red ochre was ground up to create a sort of rouge for the cheeks, and it was also mixed with oil and fat to create what we would call lipstick. The Egyptian medicine chest had various deodorants, depilatories, even anti-wrinkle cream. Oh yes, most Egyptians shaved their heads, and quite right too. Bald is beautiful. It also keeps the lice away. But you wouldn't want the sun beating down on your head all day, so all classes of Egyptians wore wigs. The poor made theirs out of vegetable fibre. The rich could afford real hair, which means they probably had real bad hair days. Right, that's it. How do I look? Ready for a day of work or a night out in Memphis or Thebes? No, perhaps not quite ready.
In ancient Egypt, how people lived was often influenced by where they lived. Some settlements began near harbours, others at the intersection of trade routes, still others at strategically important spots along the Nile. But much of what we know about urban life in Egypt comes from the remains of a unique town, which existed wholly to support cemeteries. Those cemeteries were the legendary tombs in the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens. They were located on the west bank of the Nile, across from the great religious center of Thebes. We're in the entrance corridor of one of the many tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Each one of these great spaces had to be carved out of solid rock, and it required the labor of hundreds of men. Some dug and carried the rock, some drew and carved the reliefs into the limestone, still others painted the amazing scenes we see around us. To provide housing for this valuable and skilled workforce, a special village was created. This workman's village is today called Deir el-Medina, Arabic for monastery of the town. Beginning in 1500 BC, this desolate spot was home to the artisans who created the grand tombs for Egypt's nobility. The spot selected for the settlement was anything but ideal. The relentless Egyptian sun scorches the site, and there are no trees or water. There isn't even a view of the Nile, flowing less than 2 miles away. But the location of Deir el-Medina had one thing going for it. It was only a short walk to the work going on in the valley tombs.
The people who worked on temples would have moved from one site to another right after that temple was constructed. But the Valley of the Kings was maintained for a long time, so the people who were working there maintained these jobs in their families and maintained the relationships, and we have such a full record of what went on there.
Archaeologists who found Deir el-Medina were fortunate to also discover an ancient rubbish dump filled with priceless information.
We're very lucky that they left behind their scratch paper, and that is basically this. This is what we call in the Egyptology trade an ostrakhan. It could be either a shard of limestone like you see here, or it could be a potsherd, broken pottery, and this was basically just a medium on which you wrote in ink, which is made out of lampblack and water. Fortunately, we found quite a cache of these things.
These small chips of stone are the remnants of records, diaries, and informal notes which give us a priceless glimpse into the lives of the Egyptians who lived in this place. No other city in ancient Egypt is so well documented. The workers of Deir el-Medina were highly valued and well paid. There is even record of workers going on strike to protest grievances.
The people who lived here were not slaves. There's this Cecil B. DeMille image of the royal tombs being built by captives who were then slaughtered to keep the location of the tomb secret, and that simply wasn't so.
Several hundred people at a time would have lived here. Workers were given houses which had been constructed by the state. The houses were organized along passageways which more resembled alleys than streets. There was very little open space outside, but the interiors were comfortable and even contained some furniture.
Furniture was sparse, and yet we have at least three tombs, I guess, from Deir el-Medina's cemetery that had about 25 to 30 pieces of furniture, mostly small wooden chairs and stools.
They clearly worked very hard, but working hard does not mean life was grim. The houses they lived in, although perhaps they were small, would have been quite pleasant places to be.
These low walls are all that are left to us of the houses of Deir el-Medina. Today they appear crude and inhospitable. But for almost 4 centuries, these structures were home to generations of workers and their families. Their home life might have seemed familiar to those of us living 3,500 years later.
It's the start of a new work week for the stonecutter who lives in this house in Deir el-Medina. In the summer, even the nights can be really hot, so the family probably slept up here on the roof. He'd come down in the morning and find his kids' toys on the stairs again, walk into this room, the kitchen, where his wife was probably already preparing his breakfast on the hearth here. She'd have got the ingredients from this cool cellar down the steps in the corner, and from the grinding stone over here. What's for breakfast? Well, bread, certainly, and probably cheese, onions, and beer. No, seriously, beer was a very important staple food for the ancient Egyptian. It was low in alcohol content and probably had the consistency of a soup, but you can't have everything. So he'd come here to this small bedroom used in the winter and get dressed. This was not a major problem, as all he had to put on was a loincloth and possibly some straw sandals, although most men seem to have worked barefoot. Then into the all-purpose living room. Now here would be a niche with the household gods, who would themselves be family ancestors. And over here, the seat for the master of the house. Now, these were skilled workmen, so their homes were probably quite pleasant places. Plastered walls, nicely whitewashed, matting on the floor, baskets, wooden furniture. Through here is the front reception room, with this daybed in the corner. Shh, mother-in-law's asleep. Now, there'll be no windows in these houses. That's to keep out the heat. But there will be ventilation slots in the ceiling. That would mean that the whole place would be rather dark, but quite cool considering the intense heat of summer. All in all, it's not such a bad place for a workman and his family in around 1200 BC. So it's off to work we go.
As the men went off to their jobs, they left behind a fully functioning village. Boys and younger men were organized into crews who replenished food and water supplies from the valley below. Women stayed busy with household chores. They also frequently pursued projects to earn extra money. One of these was selling lamp wicks they wove for the lamps their husbands used as they worked in the dark recesses of the tombs.
This is the path that leads to the Valley of the Kings, just over the top of that mountain. That's Deir el Medina down there. Our stonecutter probably wouldn't see it for another 9 days. That's the length of the work week. During the week, most workers prefer to stay in small huts closer to the tombs in the valley. So perhaps here he would turn to wave goodbye to his wife and children in the village below, and then continue his half-hour hike to his hard work in the tombs.
Around 1100 BC, Egypt experienced a period of instability. Outsiders invaded her borders, and civil strife was rampant within the country. It's possible that the residents of the village felt exposed and defenseless to the dangers which surrounded them. After 400 years, the workers finally abandoned Deir el Medina. This place, which had been home to ordinary Egyptians for so long, was soon forgotten. Roofs collapsed, walls turned to rubble, and the village was at last overtaken by the desert sands. More than 30 centuries later, Deir el Medina lives again. Thankfully, its citizens left many records of their presence. They've given us a wonderful picture of the everyday life which flourished in this barren place so very long ago. The history of ancient societies is revealed in events most often dominated by men. So it is with Egypt. The records left to us detailing Egyptian civilization are filled with the accounts of male kings, priests, warriors, and scribes. But of course, the true history of ancient Egypt is every bit as much the history of her women. The role of women in Egyptian society was quite distinct from other early civilizations. Babylonian, Assyrian, and Israelite societies were dominated by extreme forms of paternal control. Even Greece, the cradle of democracy, treated women as little better than household servants. But in Egypt, it is possible to trace legal equality of women as far back as 2700 BC.
Women in Egypt could go to court, they could own property, they could be a witness, they could sign documents, they could leave their property to whomever they wanted.
I often have pointed out, especially to younger women, that the Egyptian woman, who was regarded by her state as a fully legal, independent legal personality, had more legal rights than some women in the United States up until the 1950s.
As a sign of legal equality, women, just like men, were expected to perform annual service, working on the tombs and temples built each year by the pharaoh. Women ground paint for tomb decoration, wove sandals and baskets for laborers. There is evidence that women even piloted boats on the Nile. Women did not, as a rule, have important positions in Egyptian public and political life. For the average Egyptian woman, the bulk of her responsibilities remained in the home.
The woman's work was in the house. And of course, you have to remember that work in the house was not just the chores of taking out the garbage. It was almost a production industry. Bread had to be made every day. And the women were the ones who were on the millstone. And then the women were the weavers.
In the house, a woman would have to learn how to spin the thread to create enough to put on the loom and weave cloth for the family's clothing. And the process of creating even linen thread involves about 24 steps. So it's amazingly complicated. And a young woman would have had to master this and then learn to weave. And some of it is the finest quality that's ever been produced in the world. It's lightweight and like silk, almost transparent.
In farm families, women would be in charge of tending ducks and geese, but also helped in the field when needed. Women were also responsible for trading farm produce and manufactured items like baskets or pots in the marketplace. A woman's productive life began at 12 or 13. First and foremost, she was expected to find a husband and begin a family. Great emphasis was placed on having children early in life.
One has to start here saying that the Egyptian women were among the most beautiful women you have ever had. Long legs, small breasts, very upright stance, and you have these beautiful hips, long arms, almost dancers' bodies.
Courtship seems to have been very informal and surprisingly without much ritual or restriction. Relations between young men and women were also anything but prudish.
The love poetry seems to suggest that there was a sexual relationship before marriage in many cases, at least in the cases of the love poems, a young man, a suitor, would be visiting the young lady in her house, or a young woman would run out of her house to find her lover in his bed. So there's quite an explicit portrayal of sexual love before marriage.
Even in ancient times, romance was often expressed with music. Egyptians loved their music, and it was part of all aspects of their lives.
Sadly, we have no clear idea what Egyptian music sounded like, but we do have the words to some of their songs. This is part of a love song, sung by a woman to her lover, whom she calls her brother. My brother, it is pleasant to go to the pond in order to bathe in thy presence, that I may let thee see my beauty in my tunic of finest royal linen when it is wet. Fairest one, my desire shall be that if my brother cannot be with me tonight, then am I like him who is in the grave. For art thou not health and life? You know, they don't write them like that anymore.
Girls were eligible for marriage as soon as they reached puberty. Boys were slightly older, between 16 and 20. Although the courtship of a young couple might have been thoroughly romantic, the actual event of their marriage certainly was not.
Marriage in ancient Egypt was an institution, but not a sacrament. So far as we can tell, for example, there really was no marriage ceremony. A couple of families would agree that a couple should be married, or a couple might agree to marry with their family's support, but there was no real marriage ceremony.
Virginity was not a requirement of a bride or groom, but after marriage, fidelity was taken very seriously.
Once people were married, it was assumed that they would be faithful to each other. And actually, from what we know from the writings of the sages of the time, this applied to both the husband and wife. Fidelity in marriage was regarded as the proper way of life.
Divorce was not uncommon among Egyptians, and either partner could initiate the process. There was no social stigma. Divorced men and women frequently remarried. In spite of their attitude about divorce, the institution of marriage was at the very center of Egyptian society.
The ancient Egyptians often are shown with arms around one another, husbands and wives, and it's very sweet because it's not a huge demonstration of affection, but it's very discreet, and they both look very happy. The idea of family and a sense of affection and love for one another was very strong in ancient Egypt, just as it is today.
It's tempting for modern society to assume that technology has given us some unique perspective on life which the average person in ancient Egypt could not have known. But this sort of cultural bias denies the facts of the history of this place. It's very clear that the ancient Egyptians loved their country, treasured their families, and sought the same peace and contentment as we do thousands of years later. The basic elements which make life worth living were as treasured by these ancient peoples as they are by those of us who occupy our own place in time.
Thanks for choosing Ancient Revelation, your #1 Ancient Investigations channel. We are sorry, all of our operators are busy at the moment. Please subscribe and we will get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you.